We're going back into the rather familiar world of Codemasters. The first game you think of for Codies may well change depending on how old you are. The younger folks probably would go for something that's on a track, the F1 games or Dirt or whatever. If you watch my channel though, chances are it's probably Dizzy the Egg, that forever rolling earth with the big red gloves, solving puzzles and saving the yoke folk. Dizzy was, and indeed is, undoubtedly Codemasters' best known character, a mascot for the company from the mid-late 80s to the 90s, and a star of many games. But he certainly wasn't the only Codemasters character. Indeed, Codies tried to repeat the Dizzy formula not just once or twice, but many times over, never with the same success as the Oliver twins' creation. And that's the subject of today's video, a whole load of character-based games, mostly platformers, made by Codemasters, ranging from 1988 to 1994. While quite a lot of people know about Seymour, and a few people will also know CJ the Elephant, there's more. The Cartoon Time range, a bunch of other characters who starred in one game and were never seen again, and even a couple of unreleased titles. While I suppose that not all of these titles were failed attempts at creating a new mascot, something that could perhaps replace the almighty Diz, it is certainly a hefty amount of character games, usually what Codies would refer to as cartoon adventures. So have your phone to hand so you can call a Codemasters tip line, with your parents' permission obviously, and get ready for this journey into the various Codemasters characters who aren't Dizzy. The games in most instances aren't what you would call absolutely brilliant, but hopefully the video itself is. Of course, there's only one place to start. We have to start with Seymour, Codemasters' biggest and most direct attempt at a character that could fill Dizzy's red boots. Indeed, Seymour, he of the slightly more rotund potato-esque build and the huge hands that make him look like he's perpetually wearing the big foam fingers that were sold by the WWF, was spawned directly out of Dizzy. By the time he came about, the Oliver twins had mostly handed off the 8-bit micro side of Dizzy to a Macclesfield-based studio named Big Red Software, who'd started off pretty well, collaborating with the Olivers and developing the excellent Magic Land Dizzy in 1990. From there, the next 8-bit Dizzy game was going to be something different, with the idea that the egg would be rolling around in a more realistic, Earth-based setting as opposed to the fantastical kingdoms of the previous games. However, the Olivers did not agree with this change, and amicably decided they would not be involved in this project, preferring instead to concentrate fully on making Fantastic Dizzy for the NES. This proposed Dizzy game would have been called Movie Land Dizzy, but with the Olivers opting out, Codemasters themselves soon wholly soured on the idea of Dizzy traipsing around Hollywood or whatever, and instead they tasked Big Red with taking what they'd already designed and making a new character. And so, Seymour was born. As detailed in a 2020 feature on Seymour by David Crooks for Retro Gamer, Big Red artist Peter Ranson took ideas that he had sketched out for a point-and-click game that was set in the Scottish Highlands, characters with quite distinctive eyes and mouth shapes, and that work was the basis for Seymour. In his own words, a pudgy, grinning, flappy-handed, gormless wonder. On the coding side, Big Red had 12 weeks to make the game, led by coder Arthred Williams. However, this was made altogether smoother by having access to the Oliver's Dizzy game engine. The first glimpse of Seymour actually took place on cover tapes for Your Sinclair and Amstrad Action. His first game, Seymour Goes to Hollywood, was previewed by an original little demo called Seymour Take 1 in December of 1991. It's a nice little 8-screen demo that does a good job of introducing the character. Seymour takes a chance to get his big break by filming a scene where he, in classic movie fashion, saves a damsel in distress who's been tied to some train tracks. Everyone else is off on location, so he also has to film the scene and develop it, eventually watching it back to make sure everything's okay. It's quite good actually. It's a very repeatable demo because even if it's short, there's lots of ways for things to go wrong. There's the obvious stuff like either getting the damsel or yourself run over by the train, but there's other things like making sure you set the camera rolling at the right time, turning off the lights in the dark room so that you don't end up with a completely white roll of film, not absent-mindedly carrying the script around while you're filming, and so on. This sort of original demo was a trick that Cody's first played with the previous Dizzy game, previewing Magicland Dizzy by sending Dizzy 3.5 to the pages of Crash in 1990. It worked well there, and it works even better here for Seymour. And from there, we get to the first game proper, Seymour Goes to Hollywood, also released in late 1991. On the title screen, the game is actually called Seymour at the Movies, but the title was changed right at the end of development, after the title screen had been finalised. This is the debut of Cody's new hero, and just like Dizzy, he's a budget ride. The 8-bit micro versions of Seymour Goes to Hollywood retailed at the price of $3.99, the cost rising to around $7.99 for the Amiga, ST and DOS versions. The aim of the game is to take our misshapen hero and movie star around a Hollywood backlot and its various sets, retrieving the scripts from a safe that the studio boss has absent-mindedly taken the key from before going on holiday, picking up a bunch of Oscars that are dotted around the film sets that need to be given to the actors, and generally solving lots of puzzles in the process of all this hokum. It is, unsurprisingly, all very Dizzy-esque, seeing as the game uses Dizzy's engine and indeed started out as a design for a Dizzy game. That shouldn't really be taken as a criticism. Indeed, Peter Ranson, the character's creator, makes no pretense about Seymour really being anything more than a fat Dizzy. And so, while the gameplay of Seymour can't really be separated from Dizzy, although the man himself doesn't roll around nearly as much as the almighty egg, Seymour tries to be different in other ways. Not just the realistic setting, but with a whole bunch of movie-based humour, lots of little jokes and references that call back to Hollywood classics. Oh, and the word gosh, which Seymour says every time he picks up something, gosh basically being his catchphrase. Did Dizzy have a catchphrase? I think not. 1-0 to Seymour, I reckon. Joking aside, Seymour Goes to Hollywood is actually a lot better than I remember it being. It works totally fine as a Dizzy-style platform adventure once you get your bearings. It certainly has a few infamous puzzles, none more so than the maze of backlots itself, the area that acts as a central hub for the game and the portal to all the sets. This area can be pretty confusing to say the least, the sort that absolutely requires careful mapping, where you need a good eye to spot the little differences between screens, something that at times makes you wonder if you've accidentally taken a trip into the endless maze from the pawn. I could blast the game for something like this, but such areas were pretty common in text and graphic adventures. I mean, if it doesn't get bashed in The Secret of Monkey Island, maybe I shouldn't bash it here. Other than the backlot maze, the puzzles generally follow the classic Dizzy formula. You can hold 3 items at a time, and naturally all those items have to be taken to one screen or the other, combined with another item and so forth. Generally speaking, the puzzles make sense. In the end, perhaps Seymour himself has the main endearing quality, possibly because he is such a unconventional character in many ways. Not exactly the sort of clean, smooth, dashing looking mascot you'd normally expect. The game is legitimately quite amusing in parts, nice to look at, and it's generally got a charm about it. Seymour isn't Dizzy with added attitude or anything like that. He is more like the rather kooky lower class brother of Dizzy, voiced by Rodney Dangerfield. As one of Peter Ranson's friends commented while he was creating the character, he looks like a Seymour. And of course that's how the name stuck. Anywho, Seymour Goes to Hollywood performed quite well, was originally made for the Spectrum, but can be played on all the popular computers of the time, that time being 1991, obviously. I would say that the Speccy is definitely the way to go here, while the Amiga represents a decent enough graphical upgrade. There's nothing wrong with the Amstrad version either, but the C64 should definitely be avoided as that's just a lazy direct port from the Spectrum, much like a lot of the C64 versions of the Dizzy games. With no VIC-2 chip in play, this just looks exactly like the Specky version, only running slower due to the Commodore's inferior processor. There are 4 more Seymour games to look at, and they're not all adventures. Much like Dizzy, we've also got some arcadey spin-offs, the first of which is Super Seymour Saves the Planet. The copyright for this is dated 1991, but it was reviewed by the mags in early 92. In any case, it clearly came out just a couple of months after Seymour Goes to Hollywood. You get no prizes at all for guessing what classic arcade game inspired this title. One look and it's clear that this is Seymour taking on Bombjack. Seymour now has superpowers, for some reason, and he can use those to jump very high, clearing the screen of toxic barrels. You do get a bonus for clearing them in sequence. The main difference between this and Bombjack is that Seymour is actually able to jump on most of the enemies in order to squash them. Once you've cleared all the barrels, you also need to squash those mutants in order to finish a stage. What we have here actually isn't all that bad a take on Bombjack, one that plays just fine. It's got the same controls, the big old leaps, a similar sense of satisfaction at taking the barrels in succession, with the added oomph of squashing an enemy, which is always fun. It's not as if Bombjack was simply chosen as inspiration out of thin air either. Going back to the Retro Gamer feature on Seymour, Peter Ranson says that Bombjack was one of his absolute favourite arcades, and you can tell that Super Seymour comes from someone who is intimately familiar with the game. It's not quite as good as the all-time classic Elite conversion of Bombjack for the Specky, but it is actually a very fun little budget title. (1992's Wild West Seymour is the second cartoon adventure game starring our Maris Piper-esque movie star, and as it happens, it's also the last. This doesn't change the formula all that much. Seymour is still a movie star, only this time he's filming a western. However, a villain named El Bandito has decided to muck everything up by nicking the script and chucking the equipment all over the place. And naturally, it's up to Seymour to sort all of this mess out. If you liked Seymour Goes to Hollywood, then you won't find too much to complain about. Even if the game's split up into 4 acts that you can jump to via password with the help of Codemasters' very own Game Genie, this is overall a smaller and tighter game, with the same sort of reference-based humour and the odd meta-touch, like actually visiting Cody's HQ. If you didn't much care for Seymour's earlier escapades, then this isn't going to change your mind. There were no 16-bit versions of this one, we've just got Specky, C64 and Amstrad. And it's a pretty similar deal here where the Spectrum version is the best one, it's totally fine on the CPC, and the C64 version should be avoided. Generally speaking, when it came to arcade adventure games like Seymour and even Dizzy, Commodore often got the suspiciously brown and stinky end of the stick when it came to the ports. Up next, it's something more actiony. We're still in 1992, and this is Stuntman Seymour. We have a different studio this time too. This is a game by Reflective Designs, responsible for classics such as Wrestling Superstars and Santa's Christmas Capers. Oh, and they were also involved in Crystal Kingdom Dizzy, which is easily the worst of the main Dizzy games. It sounds a bit like I'm shaping up to give this game a kick-in, but actually I'm not. I'm giving the C64 version a bit of attention here, seeing as the computer has kind of been maligned so far, and it's actually quite good. It's more film-based action where Seymour takes on appropriately themed baddies in 4 movie-themed levels: the Wild West, a pirate ship, a spy thriller, and a gangster picture. The formula for this platformer is one we're going to be getting quite familiar with over the course of the video. The levels are a little bit maze-like, and while our hero can shoot as much as he wants, he also has a limited supply of bombs that you throw by pressing down, and these are handy for enemies who are above you or on small platforms that you need to jump on. This is similar play to what was first found in CJ's Elephant Antics, and we'll be covering CJ the Elephant after Seymour. However, I am happy to be covering Stuntman Seymour first because, honestly, it's the best of the bunch. The levels aren't egregiously annoying like they often are in CJ, the graphics are good, we've actually got decent music. I like this one, and I think I would put it as my favourite of all the Seymour games. The shoe is definitely on the other foot here, as the C64 is where this game really shines. This sort of game is right in the Commodore's wheelhouse. The Spectrum version isn't necessarily terrible, all things considered, while the CPC version is a total stinker that runs ridiculously slowly, I'm afraid to say. We do also have our first unreleased title here, a version of Stuntman Seymour for the Amiga, also by Reflective Designs. This would have been released in 1993 and the development was virtually completed. However, Codemasters ultimately decided to not release it. In the games that weren't entry for the game, Ashley Hogg, who was in charge of this conversion, thought that it possibly didn't fit in with Cody's new design philosophy, which required things such as all games having a multiplayer element. That and by this stage, Codemasters were focusing more on consoles as opposed to computers. Happily, this version is now fully available online, released to games that weren't in late 2023 by Ashley Hogg himself. It's a perfectly okay 16-bit version. As mentioned, the game's fully complete, so there's nought in the way of bugs to contend with. The movement and play itself is serviceable, but I do think the C64 has the edge over the Amiga here. The music is far superior on Commodore, and I think it's a bit tighter in the control department too. I can't really see the Amiga version of Stuntman Seymour getting rave reviews or anything like that if it did come out, but it is a totally average and inoffensive Euro platformer. Lastly, we have Sergeant Seymour Robotcop. We're back with Big Red for another single-screen arcade, and while the copyright on the title screen says 1992, this came out as late as 1993. In fact, according to Spectrum Computing, the number on the spine indicates that this is the very last game that Cody's released for the ZX Spectrum, and I imagine that may well be the case for the Amstrad CPC and Commodore 64 too. There was an Amiga version of this game as well, although like Stuntman Seymour it ended up unreleased despite being virtually complete. This Amiga version is not available for us to play, sadly, although a video of the gameplay can be found on Dave Spicer's YouTube channel. Anywho, this is a fairly simple affair. Seymour is now a cop, and he uses his big hand to arrest criminals. Seymour engages in police brutality by grabbing the crims and chucking them into the nearest wall, which apparently counts as nicking them. Weirdly, the gang members are all based on toys or are otherwise kind of cute, and they spawn from a toy box. It is kind of an odd aesthetic, Robocop mixed with toys, although this is certainly better than the game based on the Robin Williams movie. It's not bad. A simple affair, one where you get a few power-ups such as lasers or speed boosts to help you along. In the words of the scrutineer, it's not something that I see catching on, but neither is it an experience I regret. All of the Seymour games were rolled up and chucked out by Cody's in a compilation called Superstar Seymour for the 8-bit platforms, and if I'm honest, as someone who's never had much of a feeling towards the rather bulgy chap or his games in the past, I am kind of surprised by how much I enjoyed them on this go-around. There's nothing amazing here, but it's a whole load of perfectly acceptable gaming. On the other hand, this may be because we have quite a lot of thoroughly crap games to go through in the course of this video, and Seymour just looks really bloody good in comparison. Up next in the cast of Codemasters characters, we have CJ the Elephant. He's an elephant. Not a film star or anything, just an elephant who often finds himself escaping from sticky situations, usually ones where he's going to end up being put in a zoo if he fails. And also he has a really strong umbrella that helps him to float serenely towards the ground whenever he drops down. It's not quite the same level of backstory that even Seymour had, but it fits the bill at any rate, being a typically cute anthropomorphic hero. After all, the main reason why Cody's had so many games like this, Seymour and others wasn't simply to try and recreate the success of Dizzy, it's because they had so much success appealing to younger gamers in general. The darlings absolutely knew where their bread was buttered. Cody's were very direct about this, their style becoming so distinctive and, in the end, pretty open to parody, which is why you get things like the 1993 Amiga PD game Wibble World Giddy, a funny title that clearly lampoons both Dizzy and Seymour. Anyway, the origins of CJ are quite interesting. As detailed again in the pages of Retro Gamer by David Crooks in 2022, they actually start with the New Zealand story. Yes, the classic Taito platformer that got some excellent and very successful conversions to the microcomputers, courtesy of Ocean. Now, originally, the C64 conversion of New Zealand Story was being handled by an Irish studio named Choice, before Ocean decided that they were going to take the development in-house. Still, rather than abandon all that work, the trio who were working on the conversion, Jonathan Temples, then Jonathan Smythe, David Clark and Ashley Hogg, set up a new studio named Genesis and used the aborted New Zealand Story conversion as a basis for an all-original platformer with a new hero. And that hero would be CJ the Elephant. Eventually they sent a demo to Cody's, they liked what they played, and the rest is, as they say, good gravy. Oh, I meant history. And so, this game was the end result. CJ's Elephant Antics, originally released in early 1991 on the Commodore 64, although it would end up with versions on the Speccy, Amiga, Atari ST, PC-DOS, and eventually the NES, that last version appearing on 1992's Quattro arcade cart. I went through the base of the gameplay already when I looked at Stuntman Seymour, and this is the base for that game. You can shoot peanuts as much as you want, and you can also use a limited supply of much stronger bombs to deal with enemies that are in trickier spots. The levels can be mazy, often with big falls where you can't quite see where you're landing. This is where the umbrella comes in, making CJ fall quite slowly and allowing you to control a fall a whole lot better, rather than every fall just being a wholly irritating leap of faith. Once you realise that the whole base of this game is initially a conversion of the New Zealand Story, the design of CJ's Elephant Antics makes a lot of sense. The unconventional paths through levels that take you in all directions, the occasional dead end, the tight passages and the often ruthless positioning of spikes. Yeah, those are all New Zealand Story type things. CJ's Elephant Antics certainly isn't on New Zealand Story's level, but it isn't a bad title, although you should absolutely play it on the C64 as opposed to most other versions. It is a generic enough Euro platformer, one where you have several stages that are based in different countries, appropriately filled with stereotypical enemies and landmarks that represent said country, with the eventual goal of getting CJ back to his home in Africa. The bombs are absolutely the key. You need to make use of them a lot, and if you try, admittedly like I did at first, to get through the game without using the bombs, in the worry that you might run out or something, you are going to have a wretched time, dying all over the shop. Beaten enemies usually drop bombs, so you're unlikely to run out. Therefore you should actually use them. For a £3 tape? Yeah, it's certainly decent. As evidenced already with Stuntman Seymour, this is just the sort of game that the old Commodore excels at. The levels can get kind of annoying at times with the waiting around for moving platforms, the dead ends, the looping back just to get bonuses and other Euro platformer type irritants, but that is the nature of the beast. As for the other versions of the game, well, I would avoid this like the plague on Spectrum. It's slower and the gameplay is simply not up to scratch. The Amiga, ST and DOS versions are all totally fine but not as good as the C64, and the NES is definitely on the C64's level. Still got the bright graphics, smoother, and with a couple of little add-ons such as a speed boost. Mind you, that one's not exactly a budget game. So the C64 or the NES are definitely the ways to go here. By the way, if you're a fan of rude cheat codes, then CJ on the C64 has a great one. If you type in hairy arseholes, all caps and no spaces on the main menu, you get infinite lives and a level skip. Nice. Not quite as rude, but still of note, is the unreleased Amiga Stuntman Seymour, where you type in "you see that poo," again no spaces, for similar cheats. Late 1991 sees the release of the second CJ game, CJ in the USA. This came out on every platform that the original did, with the exception of the NES, and this time the game's actually made by Big Red Software as opposed to Genesis. Shockingly, this game doesn't change a whole lot. It's more elephant-centric platforming, only this time with a wholly American theme where CJ floats about, rescuing the kidnapped members of his family, shooting peanuts and throwing bombs at various people and animals that represent the good old US of A. Why, there's American footballers, coppers, cowboys, rattlesnakes. There's even freaking clan members. Not a joke, CJ fights the good fight and spits peanuts to kill racists. I can't think of too many games where clan members are random enemies, but CJ in the USA is one of them. Anyway, it's a similar deal to something like the second Seymour game. If you already liked the first CJ game, then you're probably going to like this one, and if you didn't, well, this is a local game for local people, and there's nothing for you here. As someone who doesn't have a whole lot of love for CJ in general, I think that on balance I slightly give the nod to CJ in the USA over Elephant Antics, because it's got a bit more bite to it. Once again, the C64 version is most definitely the one that you want to play over any other. The Amiga's fine too, but it just hits best on 64. The Spectrum? Yeah, I'm afraid you're going to want to skip that one. Alas, we don't have quite as rude a cheat code this time out, but you can still enter "I've got a lovely bunch of coconuts," all caps, spaces included, on the menu for your dose of Infy lives. So, things are going quite well for CJ. Both Elephant Antics and USA did quite well on the shelves, certainly no complaints on Codemasters' behalf and all that. They are, of course, quite late games in the grand 8-bit micro scheme of things, and the end of the micro's commercial life presents an awkward time for CJ the Elephant, one where there's not one, but two unreleased CJ projects. The first of these was CJ in Space. "Holy shit, I'm in space!" exclaimed CJ, as he and his family mount a space shuttle and presumably go up to do battle against aliens and other intergalactic ne'er-do-wells. The idea of CJ going up into space for his next game was teased at the end of CJ in the USA, but the actual history of this game is mysterious. It was mentioned in an Amstrad Action feature on upcoming releases in September 1992, saying it would come out as part of a Cartoon Crackers compilation, and it would also be the first time CJ the Elephant graced the CPC. However, it was never mentioned again. Generally, it's believed that work never really got going on CJ in Space, and we don't even know who worked on it. Games that weren't have asked folks from Genesis, Big Red and Reflective Designs, but none of them were involved in the project. And so, it remains a mystery. We do have a lot more material for the fourth CJ game, the one which, in all likelihood, replaced CJ in Space pretty quickly in development. The fourth game, scheduled for 1993, is usually referred to as either simply CJ's Fourth Adventure or CJ's Island Antics, and it was done by a whole new group of people, apparently ones who had little experience but were trying to get into the industry. Not surprising, seeing as it's a different sort of platformer, more simplistic than the usual CJ fare, more typically left to right, and with some decent tunes thanks to Gerard Gorley. This game did actually come out in a different form. It was basically finished as CJ's Island Antics, and the main man behind the game, Junaid Wahab, got paid $1,000 for it, but Codemasters made the decision to not release it, presumably thinking that it wasn't worth it to do so, as they were exiting the 8-bit micro world. However, this game eventually surfaces on, of all things, a West German magazine called Magic Disc 64. In March 1995, yes, that late on, a game called Jimbo appeared on Magic Disc's cover, and this game is basically CJ's Island Antics under a different name. It's pretty meh. A different sort of platformer, but not a memorable one by any stretch of the imagination. I suppose the main wonder people may have here is the existence of a C64 mag in 1995. And here is where I tell you that Magic Disc 64 actually didn't cease publication until the beginning of 1996. And no, it wasn't the last C64 magazine out there in Germany. Why, there's one called 64er that actually ran, in one form or another, all the way up to January of 1999. They really freaking love the C64 in Germany, it must be said. It's a couple of years down the road, but CJ the Elephant finally graces shop shelves again in March of 1994, and this time he's in entirely new surroundings, that being the Sega Game Gear. CJ Elephant Fugitive may appear to most to be the third CJ game, but of course we know better. Also, in many ways, it is a reimagining, not really a remake, but a reimagining of the first game, Elephant Antics, but with a whole lot of new levels attached and a load of tweaking with the existing ones. This came about because Codemasters were briefly interested in resurrecting some of their older names on consoles. It seems like they lost interest in doing that pretty quickly, although I find it funny that CJ the Elephant was picked out of the archives for a new game as opposed to, well, Dizzy or even Seymour. What's also funny is how the game got its name, detailed in Retro Gamer. Paul Ranson, brother of the aforementioned Peter Ranson from Big Red and an executive who commissioned games at Cody's, came up with it, and he says to Peter Crooks that at the time he wanted to capitalise on the success of The Fugitive, as in the 1993 Harrison Ford movie. That's rather hilarious to me. I can picture someone in the games shop pondering over what to buy. That Fugitive film was really great, real tense, edge-of-the-seat stuff. Tommy Lee Jones sure deserved that Oscar. I wonder if there's a game that's like The Fugitive that can give me a similarly heart-pumping experience. Ah, hold on. Perhaps this Game Gear title starring an umbrella-toting pink elephant that has Fugitive in the name will provide me with similar thrills. I'll take it. All kidding aside, Elephant Fugitive is definitely the best CJ game. The new content is good to see, it's got the smoothest play, the nicest graphics, the levels feel better. While I don't think it quite managed to capitalise on the success of The Fugitive, it is a pretty good handheld platformer, and it marks the end of CJ's adventures. They are... well, I've always generally found them quite middling, to be honest with you. The character is kind of a generic one, although the games themselves aren't all that offensive, and they do have their good points. Definitely not as good as Seymour, but there are folks out there who really enjoy the likes of Elephant Antics and CJ in the USA, and, well, more power to them. Generally they're okay, but not really my cup of tea. Our third character isn't as well known as Seymour or CJ, but they've got a few games and, well, I actually think I prefer this guy's two main titles to any game starring the two guys we've previously covered, or at least I prefer one of them. Here's Big Nose the Caveman. A classically styled Neanderthal somewhat in the vein of old Hirsute Captain Caveman, Big Nose is the creation of a studio named Optimus Software based in Stockton-on-Tees. The studio was founded by Darren and Jason Falkus, and you may know those names. Eventually Optimus was bought up by Iguana, which was then bought up by Acclaim. Optimus was named Acclaim Studios Teesside, and they were responsible for the much-loved Shadow Man on N64. Both Falkus brothers have a lengthy and still active career in the industry, but here we go all the way back to 1991 and the first Big Nose game, which came after Optimus had worked on various other games for Cody's, including Powerboat Simulator and SAS Combat Simulator. There are two versions of this game, one for the Amiga and the ST, and another for the NES, which is similar but different. I believe the computer one is the original, and it's actually a very pleasant platformer. Our caveman is quite fast, and his main attack is his club. Now, by itself, the club isn't a great weapon, as it barely has any range, but Big Nose can pick up stones and throw them, chucking as many as 3 at a time. Not only are these stones much more useful, but they also allow Big Nose to take an extra hit. There's several stages scattered across 4 islands, most of them are pretty short and feature a boss, and generally it's quite fun, with the odd little secret to be found. I only wish there was a bit of in-game music to enjoy, as the game's a bit bare with just the sound effects. On the whole, yeah, it's a good platformer. Not great, but it's entertaining. The NES Big Nose the Caveman also came out in 1991, released through Camerica. It is, of course, an unofficial title. The principle is the same, although the levels have had a few changes here and there. Generally they tend to be a bit shorter than the ones in the Amiga game, although they may have split a few stages in half and what have you. Also, there's shops between stages where Big Nose can buy spells and power-ups which allow him to do things like up his stone throwing rate, vanish every enemy on the screen, or jump on enemies to kill them in the traditional fashion. We do have some in-game music, which is fine enough. However, I think this is a fair bit worse than the Amiga game. In the main, it feels a lot cheaper, often pulling off some real bullshit tricks. I can't stand it when you can't go back in a platformer, and there's several times where if you scroll a screen that little too far, you're faced with an impossible jump, and you end up losing a life. Other annoying things include not automatically moving with a moving platform, which is just irritating in the extreme, and again, often results in losing a life. This is especially bullshit seeing as this game has no continues. On the whole, yeah, this just feels worse than the Amiga game in every respect. There is another version, mind you. We covered CJ Elephant Fugitive earlier, saying that it was an idea of Cody's to bring back some of their older games on the 8-bit consoles, and the same could have happened with Big Nose. Dino Basher starring Big Nose was scheduled to be released for the Master System and Game Gear in late 1993, and it was virtually finished. The whole game's done, the cover art's there, it had a review from Sega Power. Basically all it needed was for a darling brother to cock his finger and give the nod to roll those duplication machines. And yet, that didn't happen. Unseen64 speculates that the initial reviews, which were poor, may have been why Dino Basher ended up unreleased, or that Cody simply decided to stop focusing on the Master System, but no reasoning has actually been confirmed. Anyway, Dino Basher is pretty much a straight port of the NES Big Nose. The colour is a little different, but the levels are the same and not a whole lot has changed, including all of the bullshit. Here's another load of crap. Introduce a flying stage and put you straight into the flying, giving you 2 seconds to react to the new controls, otherwise you drop to the bottom and lose a life. Oh, and Sod's Law is that it's your last life, so that's a game over. Yeah, I don't like this game at all. Go play the Amiga version instead, it's much better. Or indeed, go play the Atari ST version if you fancy it, as it's much the same as the Amiga on that computer. The console game can rock off. The 8-bit micros got just one little taste of Big Nose, and it came after his first title. Big Nose's American Adventure came out for the Spectrum and the C64 in early 1992. Just like CJ, the caveman's off on a trip to the States, only here he's rather unexpectedly transported through time to modern-day USA, and he decides that he's going to rescue zoo animals and let them roam free once again. This plays a fair bit differently to the first game, honestly kind of more like a CJ title, only with bigger sprites and... it's bloody awful, I'm afraid. No music, barely any sound to speak of, and again just full of annoyances. The amount of backtracking I had to do just in the first level was enough to make me want to quit. It's one of those games where enemies just appear at random all the time, so you basically never stop firing. It's got that most dreaded of Euro platformer bullshit features where you pick up an innocent looking item and your controls get inverted. There is nothing to like here at all, especially when compared to other games that Cody's were doing on the Spectrum. It's not a patch on a Stuntman Seymour, or even a Captain Dynamo. I did wonder, to be honest, if the C64 would fare better, as it seems like the sort of game that would be more up its street. And shockingly, it's worse on there. The real major bullshit here is that you go in all directions, but you have to go up quite high to scroll a screen up. So what usually happens is that you jump, and when you scroll up you bonk your head on an enemy you had no hope of seeing, and you lose a life. I bloody hate that, and the up to jump is so wonky here that you accidentally double jump so freaking much that this happens a lot. Just not a good game at all, no matter what you play it on. Definitely avoided. Now, I did say that on the whole I really like Big Nose, but I've not been overly positive about him so far. However, that does kind of change in a rather weird way with his final game. One that's not necessarily great, but it sure is an interesting trip. Big Nose Freaks Out came out in 1992, and it only came out for the NES. This was known as Big Nose and the Witch Doctor at one point in development, and there is an early proto out there showing the game in this form, but it eventually came out as Big Nose Freaks Out. The gameplay here is very different from the original, and, well, it may remind you of an altogether more famous game. Big Nose is a whole load faster, seeing as he's now perpetually riding a spinning stone. He somersaults when he jumps. All the stages are introduced with a cool splash screen, and they're called Colossal Caverns or Funky Factory or something like that. Yep, this is a Sonic the Hedgehog ripoff, and I find that interesting because there are hardly any Sonic-style games on the NES. Aside from the odd baffling mechanic that comes straight out of the Bon Cloud, it isn't actually a bad Sonic rip-off either. You get the appropriate sense of speed, there's multiple paths in a lot of the stage, going uphill, going downhill, occasional boss fights, nice colour. It looks and plays the part, although some things are maddening. Big Nose's attacks are the same, a club with no range, and stones which still allow you to take an extra hit. Again, they work kind of like the rings now. The ridiculous thing is throwing stones while attacking. The designers decided that because our caveman is rolling around when he jumps, he should just throw stones wherever when he's jumping. Logical? Yes. Absolutely frustrating? Good heavens, yes. You really shouldn't throw such facts and logic into a game like this. I mean, yes, I suppose it's accurate. We really need our caveman hero to just throw stones in random directions rather than simply straight forward when he's tumbling 20 times in the air like he's Olga bloody Corbett on a kilo of amphetamines. Otherwise people might start to think this game isn't realistic. Yeah, that's silly. Oh, and we do still have the horrifying inverted controls, only this time it happens at random when you jump on one of the many buttons that otherwise dish out bones and extra lives, and it doesn't leave you until you either lose a life or complete a stage. Inverted controls in a Sonic-esque game filled with speed and jumping sequences. I'm telling you, that is one spicy meatball. Not spicy in the sense of a nice warm tingle on your tongue, spicy in the sense of I've just put my hand in a whole vat of Carolina Reaper paste and shoved it down your trousers for a laugh, because I don't actually like you very much. These design decisions are baffling in the extreme, to a point where I almost enjoy the game more because of it. They're so mad, stupid and twisted that you can't help but laugh. So yeah, this is a flawed game, to say the least, but one I perversely enjoy quite a lot. It's definitely my favourite of Big Nose's games. Go and play it if your tastes are similarly unconventional. With the exception of one other character, the other guys we're going to look at here had just one game only, at least as far as Codemasters goes. Still, there is a lot more to look at. Seymour, CJ and Big Nose are merely the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Cody's cartoon characters. A good place to start with the rest of the pack, naturally, is the Cartoon Time label. This was a short-lived thing covering 5 Cody's budget games between 1989 and 1990, and I think the main purpose of the label was to launch and promote Codemasters' fan club, the Cartoon Club, which I believe ran from the very late 80s to 1993, and featured various perks: the odd game in the post, Dizzy-themed cards, monthly letters, merchandise, things like that. With that out of the way, let's look at the first Cartoon Time game, 1989's Little Puff in Dragonland, which also had a sequel in 1992 that we may as well look at now. Consult Software was the main team behind this title, previously best known for working on Dark Scepter with the legendary Mike Singleton at Beyond, and coders of other gems such as Kenny Dalglish Soccer Match. What we have here is supposed to be a more simplified and even more kid-friendly take on the Dizzy-style arcade adventure, but something that didn't perform too badly when released on the Amiga, ST, Spectrum, Amstrad and C64. The rather straightforward goal involves Puff, our magic dragon, putting together pieces of a passport in order to take a trip back to Dragonland and see his family. No matter what you play this on, this game is mainly a massive irritation. One of the key pulls of Dizzy, and Seymour to a lesser extent, is having a whole lot of nice platforming action to go along with the puzzles. Sure, it's flick screen, but you're moving around pretty quickly and jumping all over the shop. Little Puff strips out virtually all the platforming, and you're left with nothing but an intolerably slow hero who jumps over the odd hole, solving item-based puzzles with the annoying inventory system and the usual bunch of red herrings. Also, you only get one life, and if anything bad touches you, it's game over. Hilariously, even the dragon's fiery breath does nothing to actually stop enemies, as he is that useless. Turns out this seemingly more kid-friendly adventure is full of loose metal bits that young children are in danger of suffocating on, as it's much tougher than you might have anticipated, and not in a good way. Graphics, bad, 16-bit music grating in the extreme, the whole experience a ridiculous plot. Yeah, Little Puff can frankly do one. I do not like this game in the slightest, and it is definitely one of the worst Cody's graphics adventures. Although a couple of others we'll see later can definitely give this a run for its money. The second Puff game, DJ Puff's Volcanic Capers, isn't on Cartoon Time, but obviously it makes sense to cover it right now. Indeed, this is a totally different beast to the first game, coming out 3 years later in very late 1992, with reflective designs at the helm. In short, it's another platformer in the style of CJ the Elephant and Stuntman Seymour. Our magic dragon is now a disc jockey, but his quest to become the next Dave Nice has been thwarted by some ape named Captain Quip, who has taken Puff's records and chucked them everywhere. Possibly because they've just broken up with their missus and they only want to hear Honey by Bobby Goldsboro on the wireless. I don't know. Aside from picking up the records, the formula really doesn't differ much at all. Puff has a choice between fire and bombs to deal with enemies, he neatly floats down to the ground using his wings, and so on. The main difference is that it's worth exploring levels a lot more, seeing as how you've got to find the records. As is often the case, the C64 version, complete with fine music, is absolutely the way to go here if you haven't had enough of this sort of game yet, although frankly I think this is one of the weakest of all the CJ-type games. The general design and enemies are beyond irritating. Also, I think you'll find it is actually called DJ Puff's Volcanic Capers on the C64. At least that's what it says on the title screen. We actually don't have an Amiga version this time around, but we do have a DOS version, and despite the power boost, it's a whole lot blander than the Commodore one. And as you may expect from previous performances, the CPC and Speccy versions should be avoided at all costs, especially the Speccy version, which is beyond ghastly, a thoroughly unkempt and possibly unfinished mess of a title. The only time this shouldn't be avoided is if you so happen to see it in the flesh, on a dusty shop shelf or car boot floor for a nice price. The Spectrum and Amstrad versions of DJ Puff are immensely rare, and they're both actually worth around a couple of £100 in their complete form. Up next, here's Frankenstein Jr. from early 1990. Well, I say 1990, but in many ways this is a reskin of an earlier game by Viz Design, largely Paul Smith and Steve Howard, called Bride of Frankenstein from 1987, although the main sprite and a few clues have been changed. This arrived for the big 3 micros and nothing more, and the eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed that this is clearly from the same guys who made Werewolves of London, a game that, well, was a bit of a mess in development, and largely got lousy reviews, but is one I have a major soft spot for. I am afraid the same courtesy doesn't really extend to Young Frankenstein here. A curious thing about the blurb is that it promises a whole lot of comedy, that the quest to rebuild Frankenstein's dad is so funny that you may have a cardiac arrest. I can only assume that Mel Brooks was on his way to provide the laughs, but got stuck on the Chiswick roundabout. There's not a whole lot of humour present in this rather generic maze-em-up quest of finding keys and avoiding spooky monsters that you have no defence against, nor is there much in the way of fun. You get much more in the way of laughs when you're aimlessly and half-nakedly trotting around Hyde Park in Werewolves of London, waiting for the night's dose of lycanthropic japes. It's not terrible as such, it's just, yeah, precisely as dull as it looks. If you got so annoyed by the last game that you will frankly burst like Mr. Creosote if you see another title that's based around aimlessly opening doors, then you may want to skip over this next Cartoon Time game. It's Olli and Lissa 3, The Candlelight Adventure, once again a game for the Speccy, C64 and Amstrad. The timeline of this series is very confusing, it must be said. The first Olli and Lissa was released by Silverbird, Telecomsoft's budget label, in 1986. That was it for a couple of years, at least until Silverbird was then sold off to Tudor Enterprises shortly after Microprose acquired Telecomsoft. From there, the game's creators, Ionis Software, also talked to Codemasters while also sticking with Silverbird. I'm not totally sure, but I think that Olli and Lissa 3 may possibly have come out a couple of months before Olli and Lissa 2 did. In any case, the games actually performed quite well commercially. Here, the fine art of opening doors is in the service of repairing Olli's beloved automobile. As is seemingly always the case, some bastard has decided to disassemble the old banger and chuck the parts all around Olli and Lissa's castle. If you like opening doors, then this game isn't bad. It moves very quickly, which is a bonus. The main pull of the game is that it does its best to mess with your head. The layout of the castle is very unconventional, with doors that lead all over the shop. You may enter a new area through one door, but if you try to exit via the same door, you won't necessarily go back to where you came from. It is odd, certainly the sort of thing that requires careful mapping, and truthfully the whole thing does become a massive pain in the arse before too long. I will, however, give the game credit for the nice graphics, the speedy controls, and the very personable nature of our hero. I admittedly couldn't really give a toss about someone tearing apart Olli's beloved jalopy, but I will at least vaguely nod my head and suck my teeth in solidarity while he cries to me about it. You know, like that. Oh, that's a bad break, Olli. Anyway, it's your round. Our next game has two names, depending on what you play it on. We're still in 1990, and on the 8-bit micros this is Prince Clumsy. On the 16-bit ones, it's The Sword and the Rose. This rather typical tale of a prince rescuing a fair maiden is best described as a flick-screen take on Ghosts and Goblins, featuring enemies that spawn at random, a foodometer for your health that's always going down, and a similar set of weapons, a knife, an axe, a torch, and so on. It is a pretty quick and easy game, to be honest, easily finishable in 10 minutes. Although it is a flick-screen title, you move very quickly, with the aim being to quickly hunt around for the key you need to unlock the portcullis to the next area. I kind of like how the game is essentially one big level, although it is kind of ropey in parts, especially the jumping, which can be kind of unresponsive. There are some odd things about the Amiga version too, the odd sound that has clearly been nicked from another game. Alien Breed is definitely in there, and I'm sure there are a few others. I did have Prince Clumsy back in the day, so I do confess to having a bit of a soft spot for this one, even if, in all honesty, it is not very good. Our final Cartoon Time game also has two names. This is Wizard Willy on the 8-bit micros, and on the 16-bits, it's Spellfire the Sorcerer War. Yes, Sorcerer is misspelled. Some of these games really do need some proofreading, it must be said. Again, this is more of an action game. You move from left to right, you've got more enemies spawning all over the shop, spikes and mines to avoid, and you have to pick up several eyes that are dotted around the level. You can't just fire off shots willy-nilly, as you do have a limited supply of them, although you can also pick up the odd spells. One that vanishes enemies, another that makes you invincible for a time, another that gets rid of the mines, and so on. After you've picked up all the eyes, you'll get a boss fight. I find that this one, like Prince Clumsy, is, on the whole, better on the 8-bit micros. I'd say that it is pretty ideal especially for the Amstrad. The Amiga, on the other hand, This could have been good, but I hate how close you have to get to the right edge of the screen before it starts scrolling, and you get knocked around by the enemies too, which is just irritating. It's a generic game, but definitely not the worst we've seen. As ever, Codemasters love a compilation, and 4 of the 5 Cartoon Time games came out on the Quattro Cartoon Collection, putting together all of them aside from Prince Clumsy. And with that, we are most certainly not through yet. We have a whole load more characters to go through, in fact. All of these characters just had the single released game, although there is one that could have had a second, and I'm going to try my best to go through them chronologically, roughly judging it by when the games were reviewed in mags. The quality of these titles is, unsurprisingly, pretty variable. There's a couple of games I thoroughly adore here, but, well, that's not always going to be the case. Certainly isn't with our first game. Bigfoot from late 1988 is an early example of Cody's trying to get another successful character going, coming well before Seymour and still in the relatively early days of Dizzy, and they did not succeed. In an ideal world, this cartoon adventure in which our simian hero goes in search for his girlfriend would take us from the caves all the way to the city, even into a disco, finding items and solving puzzles before heading off to a final showdown in a big lair. In practice, Bigfoot is absolutely wrecked by dreadful graphics, an inventory system that's shockingly illegible, and some of the worst jumping I've found in any 8-bit micro game. This is a title where it's hard to even see what constitutes a platform and what doesn't, and half the time when you try to jump at something you'll miss completely, usually falling into some lava or other death trap. It's a thoroughly detestable game, in all honesty, easily the worst we've seen in this video so far. If you want to see someone give Bigfoot a more extended, visceral and swearier kick-in, then Rose Tinted Spectrum has a rather amusing video all about this game, and I recommend that you give it a watch. Cody's generally did keep a half-decent standard with their budget games, but I'm afraid this is one of the very worst games that they ever released. We fast forward a couple of years to April of 1991. Seymour, CJ and Big Nose are already out there, and here we have a significantly more obscure title that, just like Bigfoot, has a bit of a jungle theme about it. This is Tarzan Goes Ape, and just like Wade Barrett, I'm afraid I've got some bad news. A few seconds of playing this is enough to realise that this is the precursor to Big Nose's American Adventure. It's very clearly by the same people. Indeed, these are the same people who also made Prince Clumsy the year before, and unfortunately the quality of this game significantly down from that one. Hell, on reflection, this title makes Big Nose's American Adventure look even worse, seeing as they didn't even bother to change the music and sound effects from one game to the next. They all appeared in this game before that Big Nose title, and unfortunately all the crap things about Big Nose's American Adventure are also in this game. The dodgy scrolling, the controls that have you endlessly jumping when you don't want to, bashing into enemies on top of the screen, the thoroughly poor graphics. Yep, I'm afraid this is a game to be avoided. It's very bad on the C64, and it's very bad on the Spectrum. Happily for Amstrad CPC owners, they were spared this one.
Magic.
Right, we've got something good. In fact, it's my favourite game in the whole video. It's around about May of 1991, and a studio called Astonishing Animations has produced an absolute winner for Cody's, and that winner is a game called Slightly Magic, originally coded for the ZX Spectrum but quickly converted to all other micros, 8 and 16-bit. The game's largely by Colin Jones, who had previously made the amusing and kinda controversial Rockstar Ate My Hamster for Cody's, as well as Grange Hill for Argus Press a few years earlier. This would be Colin's final game before he decided to leave the industry, and he goes out with a bang. What we have here is one of the Specky's best looking titles, a cartoon adventure that's easily as good as any of the Dizzy games. The main goal is, of course, a classical one. You're an apprentice wizard named Slightly, a sunburnt dragon just happens to have run off with the princess while the boss man's on vacation, the spells are scattered everywhere, and you're going to have to pick them up and use them if you've got any hope of sorting out this mess. Aside from the usual item-based puzzles, the spells can also do things like transform Slightly into an animal. For example, he can become a fish in order to get through an underwater section, which is pretty cool. In the main though, what we've got here represents the best of most everything, as far as the spectrum goes. I'm sure there aren't too many Specky games in the computer's commercial period that are better looking than Slightly Magic, which is not just an absolute explosion of colour, but it's filled with fine animation and really lovely looking characters, everything drawn beautifully. Whereas Dizzy is something that makes the most out of the Oliver twins' clear artistic limitations, Slightly Magic is the result of someone who clearly has a lot of skill with the old pencil. The music's great too. Alistair Brimble is often the highlight of a lot of Cody's games, a hero who'll just about always produce fine music even when the game's bad, and this is one of his best works. And all of this for just $2.99? It's the very best of budget gaming. For that price, how is it possible to find any fault in it? This is just an absolute classic. I loved it at the time, I still love it now, and it's widely regarded as one of the best Cody's titles. The Spectrum is absolutely the way to go here, seeing as it's the original version, but as previously mentioned, Slightly Magic appeared on all the micro platforms, and, well, it's actually a similar story to the old Seymour games, or indeed the old Dizzy games. You'll have a fine time with this game on Amstrad CPC, as it's very similar to the Spectrum version, mostly the same music and same animation and whatnot. There's a little less colour in the CPC version, but it still pops fine. Alas, this is not a game that's in the C64 comfort zone, and so what you get is a straight port from the Spectrum. It doesn't actually run all that slower, but direct ports from the Specky like this one are naturally always despised by C64 fans, and the music's actually a lot better coming from the 128K Specky's AY sound chip as opposed to the SID. And then we have the Amiga version, which is also pretty good. The gameplay's all there, we obviously have a lot more going on in the way of graphics with some more background, a bit more going on with the music. It is pretty good on Amiga, although again, I think the graphics and music just look and sound better on the ZX Spectrum. Sure, it's nice to have backgrounds in this Amiga version, and the ST as well, making use of all that colour, but the darker allusions to the background on the Specky, making the most of the platform's limitations, that just pops a lot more. That's Slightly Magic to me. Still, the Amiga would have potentially seen a sequel to this great game. Colin Jones worked next on Slightly Spooky, which was at one stage planned to be released on the Specky and Lamigi. As Colin recalls for games that weren't, the Spectrum version was started but never actually finished, while the Amiga version was finished and it would have been released in 1993. However, Cody's decided against it, opting to concentrate fully on console games, pulling Slightly Spooky and a fair few other titles in the process. We don't have any pictures or anything of Slightly Spooky in action, so the game remains almost totally a mystery, one that's very much sought after seeing as it was, by all accounts, completed at the time it was pulled. Hopefully it's out there somewhere, and fingers crossed we get to play it one day. We've got another fine game coming up. We're back with Genesis Software, the folks who originally made CJ's Elephant Antics. The duo of Dave Clark and Jonathan Temples, or Smythe as he was then, have a slightly different game for us this time. This is Spike in Transylvania, occasionally known as Spiky in Transylvania or Spike the Viking, and it was originally made for the C64, although, much like Slightly Magic, it got ported to the Specky, CPC, Amiga and ST. I'm intimately familiar with the very good Spectrum version, as it was a game I hadn't played quite a lot of back in the day, but this is actually the first time I've played the Commodore original, and yep, this is really great. It's a budget adventure, one that's got a big touch of Hagar the Horrible about it, where Spike has to free his rebel friends from the big old castle that they're locked up in. He does so by finding keys, and you find keys largely through solving the puzzles that are dotted around. Simple stuff like using a pair of wellies to get through some mud, a crucifix to defeat ghosts, a couple of ingredients for the rubbish wizard, and so on. This isn't a challenging game or anything, it's just a nice relaxing one in the main. The graphics are nice, the music is really good, and it's just a decent little adventure. Really good going for a budget title. As I already mentioned, this is also pretty good on the Spectrum, it's totally okay on Amstrad, and guess what? It's pretty damn good on the Amiga and the Atari ST too. I mean, it's not going to challenge the likes of Monkey Island or anything like that, but it's fine fare for a few quid. You know, like Fine Fare, the old supermarket. Anyone remember Fine Fare? Hey? Anyone remember white dog turds? Hey? Anyone remember the past? oh, sorry, my inner Peter Kay come out there. Anyway, go play Spike in Transylvania. We jump forward almost a year to May 1992, when we get the last really big burst of cartoony games from Codemasters on the micros. It feels like, especially on the 8-bit micros, Codies know that the clock's ticking very close to midnight, and so we end up with a whole load of games shoved out there. Not that they're all bad or anything, mind you. First up, we have Murray Mouse Supercop from May 1992, a game that appeared on the Spectrum and C64, but is pretty clearly designed with the Specky in mind. Old Murray here may be the most obscure of all the Codies characters. Honestly, I didn't even know he existed until a few years ago when I did the big old vid on Codemasters itself, and his one game features you going into sewers and nabbing 10 members of a rodent mafia. It's traditional Codies cartoon adventure fare, puzzles and inventories and so forth, and it's not that bad. It feels oddly like a throwback of sorts, a game with little in the way of music or fanfare, almost like something Codies would have put out a couple of years earlier. A slight game, perhaps, not a bad one, and perhaps worth checking out if you really want another Dizzy or Seymour-esque experience, if you've drained all you can out of Slightly Magic and so many others. Perhaps you'll squeeze a bit of time out of Murray Mouse. Definitely do it on the Specky though. The C64 version is just a direct port and is not worth the trouble. Also from May 1992, we have The Quest of Agravain, another medieval-tinged platformer in a similar vein to Prince Clumsy, and a game that only came out for the Amiga. What we have here is best described as ghosts and goblins mixed with Rainbow Islands. Just like G&G, you're dressed in a suit of armour, and you can take 3 hits. The first knocks you about a bit, the second removes your armour, and the third kills you. And as you can see, it's like Rainbow Islands because the stages scroll upwards. There's a lot of jumping from platform to platform as you try to reach the door at the top of each stage. I've played Agravain a few times now, and I think I'm a bit more positive about this game than people generally seem to be. This runs and controls a lot nicer than a lot of Codies action games from around this time, and the music's not half bad. Really not too bad for a title that costs £8, although there's obviously no reason why you would play this over the actual Rainbow Islands. It's certainly not a bad Rainbow rip-off, mind you. I mean, it's sure as hell better than Ed the Duck or Top Banana. June 1992's Steg The Slug from Big Red is a bit different to what we've seen so far. This is a puzzle game that's more in the vein of something like Lemmings or Krusty's Funhouse, and it's mainly something to play on your Amiga, although there is the usual trio of 8-bit versions. You play as the aforementioned Steg, and you must get a bunch of maggots home to the nest that's in each level so that the younglings can feed on them. Mainly you do this by capturing them in bubbles, which should ideally float to the top of a stage, avoiding things like spikes and fans or other ceilings that will send them right back down to your, foot. If I'm honest, I don't get this game an awful lot. Steg can slither around everywhere, including walls and ceilings, and he does get the odd power-up to help him out, but you don't seem to do an awful lot here except endlessly blowing bubbles in the hope that one of them ends up being correct. This may have worked better, I reckon, if you could just see more of the game area at once, as you can in something like Lemmings. Then it would be a bit easier to track the lousy maggot's progress and check that you're on the right path, as opposed to mindlessly blowing and hoping for the best. Mindless blowing just is not the way to go through life. When it comes to handling maggots, Steg certainly isn't on the level of Bob Nutt. Frankly, he's not even Robson Green, and I can't recommend this game at all. We stick with Big Red for our next game, July 1992's Grell and Fella in the Enchanted Gardens. Although when you load it up, the game's actually called Grell and Falla, which makes more sense seeing as Falla is a fairy and certainly not a fella. Again, a little quality control from Cody's wouldn't go amiss, but at this stage we're just crapping out as many 8-bit games as we can before the lights go out, so sod it. This is an interesting title. You play as both Falla the aforementioned fairy and Grell the dwarf, switching between them with a press of the enter key, and the goal of each stage is to rush through your sorcerer boss's gardens, pacifying all the creepy crawlies that have been possessed by the previous owner, doing so with your respective punches and spells. So yeah, it's kind of a single-player co-op title, one where both Grell and Falla have their own respective strengths in the power and speed department, where they can share items and even revive one another in a pinch. If either Grell or Falla's life drops to 0, the other one has a short time to save them with a heart before they actually die. Also, you can maintain the gardens for bonuses if you wish, growing new plants, buying the stuff you need from a shop with the money you earn, and earning a lot more cash from the sorcerer for actually getting your Monty Don on and greening up those fingers. There's quite a lot going on for a budget title, especially a very late one like this game. And while this is quite ropey in parts, it's got some different little mechanics about it, reminding me a little of System 3's utterly excellent Flimbo's Quest with a couple of extra bits. This only came out on 2 platforms. I wouldn't really bother with this game on the Spectrum, but it plays and looks a lot better on the Amstrad CPC. These certainly weren't the only planned versions. A C64 version is out there on the internet and has been for some time, but it never actually got released. It would have featured on a compilation, but Cody's ended up binning it. Shame, as I feel this sort of quite speedy game fits the C64 quite nicely, for obvious VIC-2 hardware scrolling reasons. July 1992's Turbo the Tortoise has a bit of a different backstory, seeing as, originally, it's not a Codemasters game. It was first published for the C64, Spectrum and Amstrad by Sheffield's High-Tech Software, a budget label that's most known for making many licensed Hanna-Barbera games of varying quality. Indeed, Turbo the Tortoise does stand out a little in the high-tech library by virtue of not being based off a Hanna-Barbera cartoon. However, barely a month after the game came out, High-Tech went bust. Not to worry, Codemasters started working with Visual Impact, the team behind the game. They quite liked Turbo the Tortoise, and so they re-released it a couple months later in 1992. As it happens, the game is decent. Turbo gained superpowers after a botched experiment, he now has the ability to travel through time, and he must go through 6 different time zones to collect items for his friend Dr. Mulliner, who's creating some sort of cybernetic contraption. This is an all-action affair, no cartoon adventuring to be found, and whether you go for it on Speccy, Amstrad or C64, it plays very well. Somewhat Mario-esque in its design, but not totally a rip-off, strong scrolling on all the platforms, a nice-looking sprite to play as. Yeah, this is actually rather enjoyable. A very strong late 8-bit micro release that I can definitely recommend, and always something that's nice to see in these very late days. Mainly because it's evidence that some people most definitely did give a crap about making and releasing something good, even at the end of the commercial life of the 8-bit micros. September 1992 sees the arrival of B-52, and it's not a platformer. Instead, it's a shoot-'em-up, one that originally came out for the NES. Indeed, it only officially came out for the NES, although there is another version. This isn't a bad little title. You simply have to fly around each area and suck honey out of the flowers, returning the honey to your hive whenever you get full up, avoiding or taking out various traps and creepy crawlies along the way with your stinger and projectiles. While it looks cute, it does get hard pretty quickly. Those insects can come out of nowhere. I guess if you were to compare this to anything, it's kind of like a cutesy version of Choplifter. One of the main ways you can fail is that if you die while you're filled up with honey, you won't be able to get honey from those same flowers again. And this can, if you die too much, make a stage unwinnable, similar to the hostages you have to rescue in Choplifter. Mind you, you are likely to run out of lives before that point. On the whole, it's an okay enough little distraction, although it is actually better on the C64. This computer version was supposed to be released in 1993, and what we've got here is basically a finished game, one that was coded by Nick Taylor, who also made the ill-fated C64 port of Grell and Faller. And alas, B-52 would also meet a similar misfortune, with Cody's deciding not to put it out due to it simply coming too late, even though the game had already been reviewed by Commodore Force. However, B-52 is easily available, mainly because Cody's did allow Nick Taylor to sell the C64 version of the game himself via mail order. The C64 version has slightly different levels to the NES one, and it's better on the whole. While it's not bad on the NES, this game just feels altogether right on the Commodore. It's October 1992, and Codemasters are still putting out new budget cartoony heroes for the microcomputers. And hey, more power to them for doing so. It's actually a bit of a surprise for me to see that Captain Dynamo came about so late, as he is certainly a hero with a game that I remember well. But hey, I guess that shows I also ended up sticking with the Spectrum until pretty close to the commercial end. This game was produced in-house at Codemasters, and I believe the Amiga was the primary platform, although we still have versions for the Speccy, C64, Amstrad and DOS, so it's pretty easy to get your Dynamo fix. Our man here is not an animal, but he is an old superhero who's tasked with stopping the evil Austin von Flyswatter from stealing all of the world's diamonds. And no less a figure than Dave Darlin himself has joined up with the other big world leaders to persuade him to come out of retirement and get back those diamonds. Cody's games can be so very meta sometimes. This is another Rainbow Islands-ish game that mainly scrolls up, and while Dynamo doesn't have too much in the way of powers, he can jump very high and also stomp on enemies. Stomping on enemies actually isn't too common in the world of Cody's games, so that deserves mention. It's a simple and brief enough platformer, weighing in at a mere 6 levels, and it's serviceable. Thoroughly acceptable gaming, much like Sword of Agravain. If this were sold at full price, you would be rather annoyed at it, but then again, it wasn't. It's £8 on the big micros and £4 on the little ones, much like everything else we've covered. The Amiga is definitely where it's at as far as the versions of the game go. You may also want to try the C64, but generally the 8-bit micro versions are far too slow and tiny in the graphics department to be worth bothering with. Surprisingly, there were also plans for a second Captain Dynamo game, one that would have been released for the C64 in 1993. Its existence was known about for some time, but a prototype was actually found in 2019, and it's available on games that weren't. This is a very different game to the first one, and something that's actually got a bit of potential. It's a side-scrolling game where you go around each stage and defuse all the bombs before they explode, quickly rushing as fast as old Dynamo can go from one bomb to another. The prototype is still a work in progress. Most of the levels are done, but there's not a whole lot in the way of sound, and you need to press 1 in order to skip to the next level. But yeah, this could have been decent, and most likely better than the first title. Alas, it was cancelled for pretty familiar reasons. It was simply too late in the day, and Codemasters left the 8-bit micros behind before Captain Dynamo 2 was completed. Our last game is a strange one indeed, one that very possibly doesn't belong here at all. However, I am not sure when I'd get a chance to cover it again, so here goes. If you look at the lists of games that Cody's released for the Amiga on places like Hall of Light or Lemon Amiga, you may spot a 1992 game called Crash Landing that's credited to them. Just from the screenshots, you may think it looks a bit ropey compared to the usual Cody standard, and the plot thickens further if you actually play it. This is a very generic platformer with a bit of the adventure stuff going on, the odd pickup to make or whatever, but the quality is way down from what you would expect of Cody's. Barely any sound, very dodgy movement where you can't even jump if you're walking or climb down a ladder, inconsistent sound samples and sprites that have undoubtedly been taken from elsewhere, a generally bare game. It feels, to be honest, a lot like a public domain title. And honestly, that's because it very likely is one. The two people who worked on the coding and the graphics, S. Green and M. McCallion, certainly aren't credited with any other Cody's games, or indeed any other games at all. M. McCallion is Mick McCallion, and he was part of the Amiga demo scene. He was known as Quest, and he was in the Anarchy group. Meanwhile, very little is known about S. Green. While I'd assume this person was also in the scene, we don't even know his first name, so it's kind of hard to check on somewhere like Exotica. Also, there's pretty much no supplementary information out there about the game. No reviews or indeed any magazine coverage, no instructions, no box art, not even a scan of a floppy disk. So with all this in mind, why does Crash Landing get credited to Codemasters when there's no Cody's branding on this game at all? Well, it appears that the only thing linking Cody's to this game is the scene release of it. The title was cracked and released by the group Scoopex, and they credited the game to Codemasters. Whether they were misinformed, or if they were just making a little joke, is, alas, unknown. And so it is almost certain that this game has nothing whatsoever to do with Codemasters. At best, it could be a prototype for something else we know barely anything about, but I'd say the chances of that are very low. Still, it's an interesting little subject, and I thought I should mention it. And with that, well, now I think we're done here. There is one other cartoony game starring a character from around this time that is definitely worthy of mention, that being a certain Linus Spacehead. However, I think that's a big enough game in size, if not stature, for it to be examined by itself, away from all these other titles, rather than right at the end of a video that's already well over an hour long. This look at all the other Codemasters characters has certainly been revelatory. I think that even I was surprised by just how many there were kicking around, and even if we have honestly had a whole lot of thoroughly middling gaming going on over the course of this video, there's been the odd surprise, as well as the occasional gem that's clearly a bit more quality than most of Cody's usual output. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and until the next time, bye for now.